Good morning, everyone. There are three categories of resources that help us to relieve burnout. The last 2 weeks, we discussed the first two, and this week we'll dig into just the tip of the iceberg with the third as we look at our internal resources. This is what creates our perspective that develops the ability to appropriately identify stress and cause us to develop stress, and ultimately then what helps us or what causes us to develop burnout and what we can do about it. Welcome to Mental Fortress Mondays. I am Cheryl Karthaus. Our mission is to provide a space that we can understand the who, what, where, when, why, how of mindfulness and build our minds to be resilient to stress and to some of the burnout that we might be experiencing now in this ongoing pandemic that we're still in the midst of. We're seeing maybe some light at the end of the tunnel in the next couple weeks, but we'll see what that actually looks like. Many of us have had to take on these new roles that we've never really experienced before, and it's something very new. So providing all of these tools and a mindfulness approach, helping to understand how we can change some of the perspectives that will help us then to deal with burnout and really to become more resilient and to stress overall going forward in the future as well. This has definitely happened in my life with mindfulness practices, and so I'm confident that it can happen in yours. And my intention is to share all the ins and outs of these mindfulness type approaches that can make a difference in your life. So we're going to first here look at the model that we have. And let's pretend we have a bucket. So we are this bucket. It's a similar model that we looked at the last 2 weeks. This is our capacity when it is totally filled up. We feel capable and safe, full of energy, both mentally and physically. And when it's empty, we essentially have nothing left in the tank to keep going, nothing left to give and to push forward through some stress or burnout. And we might find ourselves really overwhelmed, and we can either end up outside of this functional and safety window, either hyper and really aroused or hypo and really shutting down. So often when we're hyper, we tend to be anxious and overactive. And then when we're hypo, we tend to shut down, maybe go numb, maybe we want to sleep if we're starting to get overwhelmed. There's a feedback loop from all of these things. There's a feedback loop with the different factors that help to improve our resilience, and then in turn our resilience it helps to improve these things. And these are to increase our mood, our productivity, when we have higher accomplishments, when we feel more accomplished and feeling more capable, feeling more confident, and then also having positive thoughts. And the more that we can fill up our bucket and the more full and resilient we feel, the more that these actually help to be fulfilled as well. So over the last 2 weeks, we talked about the things that can help get us out of burnout. Week 7, that was last week, we explored the outside. So these are all the physical things that help us to relieve burnout and then help us to get out of it as well. And then week 6, the week before, we did all around. And these are all of the things in our environment or situation that we can actually change or modify in order to help create more of an environment that helps us to be a little bit more resilient or relieve some of that stress. And this week, we're going to go into the middle here, into the internal resources, all of these things that can help fill up our bucket and improve our mental resilience. Our internal resources are fairly complicated compared to the physical movement that we looked at, and then also just being able to change our surroundings, in that they're developed over a number of experiences. And sometimes this can take time. It could even be from childhood and developing resources to cope with different things, or they can be just really salient experiences that stand out to us as really strong lessons. These things shape our perspective, and they form then the way that we interpret if something is stressful, that way that we interpret a situation, and how it then is going to in turn affect us. And that is when it could turn into burnout or something even, so burnout or different stressful events. So how do we modify our perspective, the lens that we see life through? And then in turn, we can more accurately identify what stress is, if it's going to be stressful for us, and then how to better cope with it. So if anybody's undergone traumatic events or experienced PTSD or even other intense experiences that might not be considered trauma, we can have lasting effects from this. They can become triggers, or they can become ways that we are now coping going forward in life, or going forward with different types of stresses. And there are a number of factors that can determine if in fact we're going to incorporate these events or the lesson from this impression into the rest of the world. We're not going to go too much or too deep into any of the literature or research on trauma today. The important points learning from this world and all of this research and such is that when we understand, or is the understanding of how negative experiences actually affect us. They impact our memory, they're processed differently in the brain, and they have a very different physiological effect on our body. And we are hardwired, our brains are hardwired to more quickly and easily acknowledge and interpret and then incorporate learnings from negative experiences. This is an instinctual protective mechanism that serves us very, very well in the majority of cases, and hence it being this bit of an instinctual reflex. We want to be able to more readily remember the negative situation so that in an event where it comes up again, we essentially don't get hurt again, or we don't get burned again in the future. The more intense this learning experience, the more intense this memory and aversion to putting yourself then in that same situation again. And so when we find ourselves in an already stressful state and we have an experience that we in turn also find stressful, this kind of compounds how we interpret this event. It's fairly significant when we look at different types of stress, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. So just for an example of this being something that could be self-preserving, we have an example of a child being told not to touch a hot stove. Very common. We've heard this example several times. So the child's told not to touch a hot stove. They're playing near the stove, or they go near the stove, and now if they don't actually manage to touch the stove this first time, they might engage in the same behavior the next day, thinking, okay, yeah, well, I wasn't supposed to touch the hot stove that time, and I know I'm still not supposed to touch it, but kind of going to forget that lesson. If they go near the hot stove, they're told not to touch the hot stove, and they actually end up touching the hot stove, they're going to get burned. That child is going to learn a very strong lesson, especially compared to that initial interaction where they don't actually touch the hot stove. That child probably will never go near the stove again if they're ever told that it's going to be on. They might have very different feelings about the stove to begin with. Maybe they even might not want to start cooking when they become of age or are capable. They might have different fears or different adversities into putting themselves in that situation. And so that is where that learning comes into play. And it really can help us. It really is there to protect us and provide safety. And so understanding how our reactions occur is really important to kind of honor that and give space there for all of these things that can be really helpful, even if they seem like they're causing us stress at the time. For all of these reasons there, it's easier to recall and remember those negative lessons that we experience, or uncomfortable ones, I would like to say, because they're not necessarily negative, especially in that case. If the child gets a little bit close and is scared enough, then they won't go near it again, or maybe that lesson is engraved a little bit stronger. And so it's not necessarily a bad lesson to learn, at least they didn't fall in the fire, but it's a very uncomfortable lesson. And that happens a lot when we experience different emotions that can be really negative, or I would argue to say uncomfortable. Our brains and body, again, are hardwired for these types of preservation activities. So consider the different types of stresses that we actually encounter in daily life. If there are all the physical things that could harm us, as in the example that I just mentioned with fire or something hot, the ability to learn all of these uncomfortable instances is really important and might actually help us to survive. But what about all of the types of stresses that we actually endure on a regular basis here in Canada, at least, and ongoing? There definitely are some physical threats, and not to discount any of those. A lot of the things that lead us to burnout are the psychological and social stressors. These are described by Robert M. Sapolsky in the book Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Fantastic book. I highly recommend it if you guys get the chance to read it and are interested in the lots of different aspects of what creates stress for us. These types of stressors are essentially created then internally because it's our perspective. We become upset. It's our emotional reaction. It includes these emotional stressors that come along with not getting along with a person, maybe a family member, a friend or colleague, or having a daily encounter with a difficult person that stretches our boundaries and cause us to have a bit of a difficult interaction with them and is really pushing us outside what we're used to or where we want to be. They can be sustained psychological stresses, and essentially it can become chronic, and this is also experienced, I think, by many people. I have lots of patients who come in and report these kinds of things, either difficulty in a relationship, which ends up then accumulating or really occurring every single day, especially if it's someone in the home that they're having this relationship with, or if it's a colleague or someone at work that they're seeing on a regular basis. These types of stressors are often not situations where we feel fully recovered from. And then so the stress becomes cumulative. So we go to bed maybe a little bit stressed out, or maybe you've sort of let go of it, but not really fully recovered from that feeling, that stress during the day, and still are a little bit agitated. And then over time, these can just start to build up. We want to be able to fully let go of those stressors and then be able to start the next day with a fresh perspective, and then maybe even have those encounters not be as stressful or as anxiety inducing or as much of an emotional reaction as they could. So we can learn these, similar to the hot stove example, we can learn an equally salient lesson from these negative experiences that don't actually threaten our physical health. These are formulated by us because they are our interpretation to the situation. They're literally our minds creating how we interpret this information or understanding how we interpret it, and then going forward, often we either are fearful of an outcome or we have fear about something new that might happen, even if the outcome is going to be sometimes good. I find this a lot in people trying to take a chance with a new business or trying to share their idea. There's a lot of fear in then taking that action, and that can also in turn cause stress. Now, don't misinterpret that any of these psychological stressors or the social stressors are definitely very real. They can be very significant in our lives, and they really can change the outcome of our quality of life or the community that we're living in and society and how we're kind of going about life every day. So not to downplay that the importance that they have, but also to understand that we do have control as to how we interpret this. They might be minute changes, but then they can actually make quite a significant difference. The emotions of these anticipated outcomes or the anticipated reactions from others and anticipated impact on our own self-perception can prevent us from taking action, and they can discourage our confidence and positive thoughts and mood and all of these other aspects that really help to encourage us to be able to fill up our bucket so we have all of the resources to then in turn deal with stress again. Dr. Joan Rosenberg identifies the sort of internal self, as I'm calling it, or our internal resources, as one of the most important aspects of developing resilience. She notes that we experience the greatest stability when you feel the resources from within, not from outside. This touches on the idea of really taking responsibility for all of our own feelings and how we're actually going to interpret something, and that things coming from the outside, even if they are supports from family or friends, when we are able to meet a challenge with these internal resources and feeling capable, these are what's going to provide us the greatest stability. And so we want to foster those as best that we can. So how do we build resilience to these things then? The simple and not so easy answer, or not so easy thing to do, is